In 1938, a distinctive sound echoed across American highways. It wasn't the rumble of a four-stroke engine or the purr of a gasoline motor. It was something entirely different, a high-pitched scream that truckers would come to know as the voice of power itself. The Detroit Diesel 71 series had arrived, and with it came an empire that would dominate American trucking for decades. But empires built on arrogance have a way of crumbling. This is the story of how Detroit Diesel went from industry king to corporate casualty, not because they couldn't build great engines, but because they refused to believe the world could change around them. When General Motors launched the Detroit Diesel division in 1938, they weren't just introducing another engine. They were unleashing a mechanical revolution. The 71 series engines, nicknamed Screamin Jimmies after the GMC trucks that first carried them, operated on a principle that conventional wisdom said wouldn't work in heavy-duty applications. These were two-stroke diesels, firing once every revolution instead of every other revolution like their four-stroke competitors. Each cylinder displaced exactly 71 cubic inches, giving the series its name. With a 4.25-inch bore and 5-inch stroke, these engines were compact powerhouses designed for reliable operation up to 2,100 RPM. The secret was in the scavenging system. A gear-driven roots blower forced fresh air through ports in the cylinder liner, while exhaust valves in the head expelled burnt gases. This uniflow design meant every revolution produced power, doubling the firing frequency of four-stroke engines. The result was an engine that produced more horsepower per pound than anything else on the road. But it was the sound that made them legendary. The combination of the two-stroke firing pattern, the roots blower whine, and the exhaust valve timing created a distinctive high-pitched scream that could be heard for miles. By the 1950s, these engines powered everything that moved in America. The 6V71 became the standard in over-the-road trucks, delivering 238 horsepower in a compact, reasonably lightweight package compared to its four-stroke competitors. The 8V71 could deliver up to 318 horsepower, making it a popular choice for demanding truck applications. Transit buses across the country ran on 6V71s that could accelerate a loaded bus faster than most cars. The military embraced them completely. The 6V53 powered the M113 armored personnel carrier. The 8V71 drove M88 recovery vehicles that could pull disabled tanks from battlefields. Navy patrol boats screamed across harbors on twin 12V71s, producing 435 horsepower each. Marine applications showcased their versatility. Fishing boats in Alaska relied on 6V71s that could run continuously for weeks in sub-zero temperatures. Tugboats in New York Harbor pushed massive barges with 12V71s that delivered 525 horsepower at 1,800 RPM. The engines that truckers heard screaming down Interstate 80 were the same basic design pulling shrimp nets in the Gulf of Mexico. What made fleets choose Detroit Diesel wasn't just performance, it was economics. A complete 6V71 cost $8,500 in 1965, compared to $11,200 for a comparable Caterpillar 1673. Parts were everywhere. Every GMC dealer could service them. Overhaul intervals stretched to 300,000 miles with proper maintenance. By 1970, Detroit Diesel commanded over 35% of the heavy-duty truck engine market. The Screamin Jimmies had become the sound of American commerce. But that distinctive scream was about to become a death rattle. The first crack in Detroit Diesel's armor appeared at gas stations across America in 1973. The Arab oil embargo sent fuel prices soaring from 38 cents per gallon to over $1. Suddenly, the fuel consumption that fleet managers had tolerated became a crisis that threatened their survival. The Screamin Jimmies were thirsty. The two-stroke design that provided their power advantage also created their Achilles heel. Every revolution required fresh air from the roots blower, and that blower consumed power whether the engine was working hard or idling. A 6V71 could approach 5 miles per gallon under ideal highway conditions, with real-world numbers sometimes dipping lower depending on load and terrain. Meanwhile, Caterpillar's 3406 was delivering 7.2 miles per gallon with comparable power. Cummins's big cam engines often achieved over 6 miles per gallon, a substantial improvement over many two-stroke competitors. The difference meant thousands of dollars per year per truck. Owner-operators who had loved the Detroit's power began calculating fuel costs and switching brands. But fuel economy was just the beginning. The EPA was tightening emission standards, and the two-stroke design that made Detroit diesels powerful also made them dirty. The scavenging process that cleared exhaust gases also allowed unburned fuel to escape through the exhaust ports. Hydrocarbon emissions were 3 times higher than four-stroke engines. The 1974 EPA standards forced Detroit Diesel to detune their engines, reducing power and increasing fuel consumption even further. The 6V71 that once produced 238 horsepower was limited to 210 horsepower to meet emissions requirements. Customers were paying the same price for less performance and worse fuel economy. Noise regulations added another burden. The distinctive scream that had made the Jimmies famous was now classified as noise pollution. Cities began restricting truck routes based on noise levels. The sound that had once been Detroit Diesel's calling card became a liability that limited where their engines could operate. Maintenance costs were escalating too. The two-stroke design required more frequent oil changes because combustion byproducts contaminated the oil faster. Turbochargers failed more frequently due to the higher exhaust temperatures. The roots blowers that provided scavenging air wore out and needed rebuilding every 150,000 miles. Oil leaks became legendary. The high-pressure scavenging system stressed seals and gaskets beyond their limits. Parking lots across America were stained with the evidence of Detroit Diesel's presence. Fleet managers joked that you could track a Jimmy by following the oil spots, but the joke wasn't funny when they were paying for cleanup and environmental compliance. Caterpillar sensed opportunity. The Caterpillar 3406, introduced for highway truck use in the mid-1970s, was everything the Detroit wasn't: quiet, fuel-efficient, and cleaner burning. The inline-six four-stroke design produced peak torque at 1,200 RPM, exactly where over-the-road trucks needed it. Overhaul intervals stretched to 500,000 miles with proper maintenance. Cummins pushed even harder. The Big Cam 400 delivered 400 horsepower with fuel economy that made owner-operators profitable. The company's Cummins Confidence marketing campaign promised reliability that Detroit Diesel couldn't match. Service networks expanded rapidly, challenging Detroit's dealer advantage. Inside Detroit Diesel, warning signs were everywhere, but corporate culture prevented action. Engineers who suggested four-stroke development were told that two strokes were the company's identity. Marketing departments insisted that customers would always choose power over efficiency. Management believed that General Motors' resources made them invincible. The company's response was to double down on what they knew. The 92 series, introduced in 1974, was simply a larger version of the same two-stroke design. Each cylinder displaced 92 cubic inches instead of 71, and it now had wet cylinders, but the fundamental architecture remained unchanged. The 6V92 produced 270 horsepower, but it consumed even more fuel and created even more emissions. Market research showed customers demanding quieter, more efficient engines. But Detroit Diesel dismissed the data. They believed their reputation for power and durability would overcome temporary concerns about fuel economy. They were wrong. By 1980, Detroit Diesel's market share had dropped to 20%. Caterpillar and Cummins were gaining ground with every new model introduction. The writing was on the wall, but Detroit Diesel's leadership couldn't read it. They were about to learn that in business, as in racing, it's not how fast you were yesterday that matters. It's how fast you are today. In 1987, Detroit Diesel finally admitted what the market had been telling them for over a decade. The future belonged to four-stroke engines. After nearly 50 years of two-stroke dominance, they introduced the Series 60, a complete reversal of everything they had stood for. The Series 60 was an inline-six four-stroke turbocharged engine with overhead camshaft design. It debuted in '87 as an 11.1-liter unit and was later offered as a 12.7-liter variant, producing between 280 and 400 horsepower, with torque curves tuned for fuel economy. The engine that emerged from Detroit's engineering labs looked nothing like the Screamin Jimmies that had built the company's reputation. Electronic control was the Series 60's revolutionary feature. The Detroit Diesel Electronic Control System, DDEC, managed fuel injection timing and engine protection functions with a sophistication that mechanical systems couldn't match. Fuel economy improved by roughly 8% compared to the best two-stroke engines, and emissions dropped below EPA thresholds. The irony was inescapable. Detroit Diesel had spent decades telling customers that higher RPM power was superior to low RPM torque. Now they were advertising peak torque at 1200 RPM, exactly what Caterpillar and Cummins had been delivering for years. They had mocked electronic controls as unnecessary complexity, then introduced the most sophisticated engine management system in the industry. Performance numbers proved the Series 60 was genuinely excellent. The 12.7-liter version produced 425 horsepower and 1,550 pound-foot of torque, while delivering fuel economy that matched the best four-stroke competitors. Overhaul intervals of 350 to 500,000 miles became achievable with proper maintenance, and the engine was quiet enough to comply with stricter noise regulations. By 1987, Detroit Diesel's market share had collapsed to less than 5%, and fleet managers who had been burned by fuel costs and maintenance problems weren't willing to give Detroit another chance. The company that had once been synonymous with truck engines was now an also-ran fighting for scraps. Caterpillar's 3406B was dominating the market with proven reliability and established service networks. Cummins N14 was winning owner-operators with superior fuel economy and lower operating costs. Both companies had spent the 1980s building relationships while Detroit Diesel was defending an obsolete technology. The Series 60's launch revealed how far Detroit had fallen behind in manufacturing capability. Initial production was plagued with quality control problems. Cylinder head cracking forced expensive warranty repairs. Electronic control modules failed in service, leaving trucks stranded. The company that had once prided itself on bulletproof reliability was shipping unreliable engines. Customer loyalty, once Detroit Diesel's greatest asset, had evaporated. Fleet managers who had run nothing but Jimmies for decades were placing orders with Caterpillar and Cummins. Even when the Series 60's problems were resolved, market acceptance remained limited. The 14.0-liter version, introduced in 1993, produced 500 horsepower and delivered fuel economy that finally matched the competition. But by then, Detroit Diesel was fighting for market share from a position of weakness rather than strength. The company's dealer network, once its greatest competitive advantage, had withered. GMC truck dealers who had sold Detroit Diesel engines for decades were now offering Caterpillar and Cummins options. Independent service shops that had specialized in Jimmy repairs were learning to work on other brands. The infrastructure that had made Detroit Diesel convenient was adapting to serve other manufacturers. Financial performance reflected the market reality. Detroit Diesel's revenue peaked in 1979 at $1.2 billion and declined steadily through the 1980s. By 1990, annual sales had dropped to $800 million despite the Series 60's introduction. The company that had once generated massive profits for General Motors was now struggling to break even. General Motors, facing its own financial pressures, began questioning Detroit Diesel's future. The automotive giant was losing money on every engine sold and couldn't justify continued investment in a declining business. In 1988, GM sold Detroit Diesel to Penske Corporation in a deal that valued the company at just $300 million, a fraction of its worth during its golden years. The Series 60 eventually became a successful engine, But success came too late to save Detroit Diesel's independence. The company that had once dictated industry standards was now following trends set by competitors. They had learned to build excellent four-stroke engines, but they had forgotten how to lead. By the 1990s, Detroit Diesel was no longer setting the pace in American trucking. They were running hard just to keep up. The Series 60 had established them as a credible competitor in the four-stroke market, but credible wasn't enough for a company that had once owned the industry. Market share numbers told the story of decline. In 1970, Detroit diesel engines powered 1 in 3 heavy-duty trucks. By 1995, that number had dropped to 1 in 10. Caterpillar commanded 35% of the market with engines that delivered the reliability Detroit had once claimed as their exclusive territory. Cummins held 40% with fuel economy that made owner-operators profitable. The financial impact was devastating. The company that had once generated massive profits was now fighting to remain solvent. Penske Corporation took the company public in 1993, hoping to raise capital for product development. The initial public offering raised $150 million, but it also exposed Detroit Diesel's weaknesses to public scrutiny. Investors saw a company with declining market share, aging facilities, and limited resources for research and development. Product development lagged behind competitors who were investing billions in new technology. While Caterpillar was developing the C15 with advanced electronics and Cummins was perfecting the ISX with integrated aftertreatment, Detroit Diesel was struggling to fund incremental improvements to the Series 60. The company that had once led innovation was now following trends set by others. Manufacturing efficiency became another competitive disadvantage. Detroit Diesel's plants in Detroit and Redford were built for two-stroke production and poorly suited for modern four-stroke manufacturing. Caterpillar's new facilities in Illinois and Cummins plants in Indiana could produce engines faster and cheaper than Detroit's aging infrastructure allowed. The dealer network that had once been Detroit Diesel's greatest strength was now a liability. Many dealers had switched to other brands during the dark years of the 1980s. Those who remained often lacked the technical expertise to service sophisticated electronic engines. Customers who needed service found better support from Caterpillar and Cummins dealers. Quality problems persisted despite massive investment in manufacturing improvements. The Series 60's electronic control system, while advanced, proved fragile in real-world applications. Sensor failures stranded trucks on highways. Software glitches caused engines to derate unexpectedly. The reliability that had made Detroit Diesel famous was now a memory. Customer perception had shifted permanently. Fleet managers who had grown up with Screamin Jimmies were retiring, replaced by younger executives who evaluated engines based on total cost of ownership rather than nostalgic loyalty. Detroit Diesel's reputation for power meant nothing to buyers who prioritized fuel economy and uptime. The company's attempts to rebuild market share through aggressive pricing only made financial problems worse. Detroit Diesel was selling engines at margins that barely covered manufacturing costs, let alone research and development expenses. Competitors with stronger market positions could afford to match Detroit's prices while maintaining profitability. International expansion offered little relief. European truck manufacturers had never adopted Detroit diesel engines in significant numbers, preferring their own sophisticated four-stroke designs. Asian markets were dominated by local manufacturers who offered better value than American imports. The global market that might have sustained Detroit Diesel remained closed to them. By 1999, it was clear that Detroit Diesel couldn't survive as an independent company. The resources required to develop next-generation engines exceeded the company's financial capacity. Emissions regulations were becoming more stringent, requiring massive investment in after-treatment technology. The choice was simple: find a buyer or face bankruptcy. Daimler Chrysler, which already owned 21.3% of Detroit Diesel through various investments, emerged as the logical acquirer. The German-American conglomerate needed a North American engine supplier for its Freightliner truck division. Detroit Diesel needed the financial resources that only a major corporation could provide. The acquisition, completed in 2000 for $423 million, marked the end of Detroit Diesel as an independent American company. The business that had once been the crown jewel of General Motors' industrial empire was now a subsidiary of a foreign corporation. The Screamin Jimmies that had announced American industrial might were silenced forever. Roger Penske, who had tried to revive Detroit Diesel during the 1990s, reflected on the company's decline with characteristic directness. "They had the best engines in the world," he said, "but they stopped listening to their customers." In this business, if you stop listening, you stop winning. The pattern was unmistakable. Detroit Diesel had possessed every advantage: superior technology, established relationships, financial resources, and manufacturing capability. They had lost it all because they believed their past success guaranteed their future dominance. They had confused confidence with arrogance, and the market punished them accordingly.